So we've seen how to use the regular expression validator. All we need to look at now to finish off our tour of validators is to have a look at the custom validator. So we'll use the custom validator to perform some programmatic user-defined validation on the security code. Now, interestingly, here, I'm not going to add a required field validator for this control, and you'll see why in a moment. I'm just going to directly drag a custom validator control onto the section here. Okay, so let's set the properties on it. Let's set the ID to be security code custom validator. Now, when you define a custom validator, you're going to have to write some code to actually perform the validation, which is the beauty of the mechanism. It gives you ultimate flexibility in how you perform the validation. And you have two ways of doing it. First of all, you must provide a server-side method to perform server-side validation. You must do that. But also, as well, optionally, you can provide a client-side validation function as well. And we are going to do that. We'll have, if you notice here, there's a property called client validation function. And here you enter the name of your client-side JavaScript function. So I'll call it my client-side validator. We'll implement that method in a moment. Okay, so the control to validate, that's obviously going to be the security code text box. And then display dynamic, as we've been doing for each one. We'll set the error message to be invalid security code. Set the focus to true, and we'll set the text message to be invalid security code. One last thing, validate empty text. If you set this to true, then it will attempt to validate the text control even if it's empty. And this explains why we don't need to have an explicit required field validator control as well. Just by having the custom validator and setting its validate empty text property to true, it will attempt to validate empty text boxes. So the next step, I guess, is to actually write some JavaScript. So let's click on the Source tab at the bottom of the designer. And I'm going to navigate up to the top of the page. Just make the screen a little wider to give myself a bit more space. Okay, now JavaScript functions, you can write them anywhere you want to in a web page, but conventionally people put them in the head section. So in here, I'm going to write some script. And I'm going to write the script in JavaScript. You could have chosen VB script if you prefer, but JavaScript generally is better supported by more browsers. So that's always a safer bet. And the added benefit as well is that JavaScript is quite similar syntactically at the superficial level, at least, to C#, and that's definitely an advantage. And you'll see why in a moment. Okay, now when you write a custom validator, it's going to be a JavaScript function. And the name we chose for the function when we set up the validator was my client-side validator. Now the function must take two parameters. The first parameter specifies the source of the event, and the second parameter is an additional set of information represented by the arguments. So in this respect, it's actually quite similar to .NET event handlers, where you have the first parameter is the event source, and the second parameter conveys extra information about the event. Now, the purpose of this function is to determine at the client side whether the specified control is valid or not. So the first thing you have to do is to get the value of the control that's being validated, and you can do that like this. The args parameter has a value property, and that's the value of the text box that you're validating. So that's a string. Now, the string object in JavaScript has an index of method, and what we're going to do is we're going to see. This is quite a superficial and contrived example, but it'll do for the purposes of the demonstration. We're going to insist that the security code contains the word buzz somewhere in it. Okay? So if the index of method, when we pass it the buzz string, returns -1, then it means there was no buzz in the text entered by the user. So in our scenario, we'll say that's invalid. And the way you flag it up as being invalid is to take your argument parameter, args, and it has a property called isValid, and you set it to false, okay, to indicate that the control is invalid because it doesn't have this word buzz in it. Okay, the opposite, the opposite is if it does contain the word buzz, then it's valid. So there's our client-side JavaScript function, and it will take the security code and it will make sure that it contains the word buzz. If it doesn't, then it'll flag it up as being an invalid control. Otherwise, it'll say it is valid. That's the client-side JavaScript. Remember, that was optional. We didn't have to provide this, but we've chosen to improve the performance and the experience for the user. If we go back into design mode, as well as having the client script, we must have the server-side event handler. So if you select the invalid security code validator, and you'll notice there's the event button. So if you click on the event button, there's an event called server validate. So this is how you implement the server-side validation. So if you double-click on there, it will add a method to the .NET code behind class where we can perform server-side validation. You must do this. Now, as it happens, the code that I need here is almost identical to the code that we had in our JavaScript function. The parameters are called the same thing as well, you'll notice. The first parameter is called source, and the second parameter is called args. So that's a bit of luck. Not really. Let's click on the source and go back up to the JavaScript. And I'm going to take the body of the function, and I'm going to copy that into the clipboard, and then just paste it. Okay. The code is almost identical. The only difference we need to make is that the value property is a string, and in .NET, the index of method starts with a capital I, not a lowercase I. And apart from that, the method implementation is the same. So there's at least one clear advantage of using JavaScript instead of VB script, because it's so similar to C#. Let's run the application and see if that works. So first of all, I'll enter a security code of hello Buzz. How are you? So that text contains the word buzz, so it should be valid. And it is. Now I'll just see what happens if I have buzz on its own. And that's valid. And now I'll see what happens if I don't have buzz at all. There we are. So it's invoked our client-side validation there to ensure that we've actually specified an appropriate value based on the custom validator. Okay. So if we go back into the design view, you can see we've actually specified all the validators we need. It took us quite a while to do it, but it's a lot easier than having to write lots and lots of C# code or JavaScript to perform algorithmic programmatic validation.